Welcome to Alchemy, the podcast for HR professionals who are ready to experience what's possible from the inside out. I'm your host, Sarah Maud, former HR insider and transformational coach. And I'm here to guide you into a new paradigm of HR leadership with the science, the energy, and the insights that create true, lasting transformation. So subscribe and join the movement, and let's create the future of HR together. Hello and welcome back. And today's episode comes hot off the heels of a conversation that I had earlier today with an HR director, a very enlightening conversation about something which I'm willing to guess we can all resonate with, something which we've all been guilty of, and that's catastrophizing, that worst case scenario thinking, that mental spiral that something happens or we have a thought about something, and within seconds, your mind has literally catapulted, fast forwarded to the absolute worst possible outcome. And that worst possible outcome, it's not logical. It often doesn't make sense, but it's the go-to for the mind, for the human psyche. And so in this episode, I'm going to share with you the deeper psychological insight into why we experience this worst case scenario thinking. And importantly, how do we change it? Now, in the conversation that I had this morning with, let's call her Zoe. Zoe's a very experienced HR director. She's one of my private clients. And she recognized that she's been in this pattern of catastrophizing for years, decades actually. But this was the first time that she'd really got curious about what's actually going on here. Why is it that my mind jumps to these worst case scenarios, both in her personal life and in her professional life? And it was the first time that she'd really got curious about it rather than judgmental. And what she started to see was where her mind would jump to, the specific scenarios, the particular flavor of disaster that her brain was most drawn to. And I asked her if this part of you that was so used to jumping into these worst case scenarios, if this part of you was actually trying to help you, it was trying to serve you in some way, what is it that it's doing? And she just took a few moments and really just checked in with herself. And she said, it's trying to prepare me. It's trying to prepare me to make sure that I can cope. Because if I'm not prepared, it'll be a disaster. Now that in and of itself was illuminating. That shone a light on what this part of her was actually doing, what was reinforcing this pattern. But I just had a sense that there was something else here. And so I asked the question, that part that's been trying to make sure that you're fully prepared, you're fully equipped, what's its greatest fear if you're not? And it came to her like that. She said, I'll fall apart. And for me, that made so much sense. If we've got this part of us, this often very unconscious part of us, that's got a fear that it's learnt somewhere along the lines, that if I'm not fully equipped, fully prepared, then I'll fall apart. Well, then that part of us is going to try and do what it can to keep us safe. That part of us is a survival-based response, because falling apart can be a threat to life. So this survival part doesn't have anything to do with Zoe's job role. It's not about the nature of working with people. It's not about working in HR. It's not about the demand or complexity of the role or anything at all. It is a survival-based response. A survival-based response that is within every one of us. Every one of us has learnt different survival-based strategies in order to keep safe, to keep alive. And these survival-based strategies were created at a much earlier time in our life. In fact, before we even set foot into the workplace. They were created based on our early experiences, by the environments that we grew up in, the messages that we received consciously and unconsciously about whether the world was safe or unpredictable. And so where we saw that something might not be safe, that there is a potential threat to our survival, well, then we just naturally and very unconsciously develop these patterns, these structures, these parts of us that 95 to 99% of the time are running the show. And we can be aware of the mind jumping to this worst case scenario, but without necessarily understanding what is going on. Because the truth is that for the vast majority of people walking this planet, their life isn't in danger. And Zoe's was a great example of where things have happened and she's had the immediate thought, her mind's jumped to, oh my God, I'm going to lose my job. Oh my God, I'm going to get fired. I'm going to get pushed out. In fact, I was even having a conversation with another of my private clients last week who's just been made redundant from Sainsbury's Bank. And Sainsbury's Bank was a big UK bank and was operating for about 11 years. And she'd worked for the bank for 11 years and now it's been wound down. It's no longer a bank, that everybody's been made redundant. And this particular client, she's got a healthy redundancy package, but she's aware that her mind, because it's in unknown territory and it can't predict the future, is already trying to do its best to keep her safe. And so we kind of laughed about some of the places that her mind had been going to over the last few days, because she was thinking, well, what if I can't get a job? Should I get critical medical cover? What if I can't work? What if this happens? What if that happens? What if, and it was just, in some ways it was really, it's amusing to watch the mind. I mean, one of my clients that I remember working with well over a year ago now, a guy that was very much in that worst case scenario mode, worked for a different bank in the UK. I've got a lot of banking clients. And this amazing, amazing, beautiful, talented guy was a good 6'3", 6'4", and would describe that when he was on an aeroplane, his mind would jump to, what if I fell out of the window? And we sat and we laughed about how that was literally impossible. I don't think his foot would have even been able to be sucked out the window because he was just so tall. But that's what the mind does. It literally will go to worst case scenario because it's just trying to keep us safe. And while it's trying to keep us safe, it's trying to keep us safe based on these very old experiences that we've gathered up through our lifetime. And because the mind doesn't know the difference between a real threat to life and a perceived threat to life, that this worst case scenario thinking can have a real impact on our stress. It can keep us locked in patterns of anxiety. Anxiety is very, very much based on worst case scenario thinking, trying to predict something that hasn't happened yet. And it has a huge impact on the nervous system. It keeps the nervous system dysregulated. It impacts our resilience. It impacts everything, because when we're worrying about something that hasn't even happened yet, well, we lose access to the prefrontal cortex. We lose access to the higher mind's thinking. And, I'm not going to lie, things happen in life. They do happen. But we also have everything we need in that moment to be able to deal with whatever comes our way. We were built for that. We were designed for that. And if something did happen, we have got that inner resources to be able to respond accordingly. So this worst case scenario thinking is when we're firing these survival structures when our life actually isn't in danger. We're wasting all of this mental energy on thinking about things that haven't even happened. And in a lot of my podcasts, I've talked about one of the big things that I'm seeing in the HR community is burnout. In fact, it's April. The Stress Awareness Week is around the corner. And one of the big things that I invite people to look at within my HR inner circle, within the resilience training that I run for organizations, and in my one-to-one practice, is look at the real source, to look at what is really creating the angst, the worry, the stress. Because as I spoke about in my last episode, who are you being when you are doing? What's really creating that angst, that worry, that doubt, that stress is not coming from the outer world. It's not coming from our scenarios. It's coming from the inner reality. These conditioned habitual thought patterns, these survival structures that we've developed. But if we're not aware of that, then we're just going to keep operating from our same level of thinking. And what I think is worth naming here about the particular flavor of this that I see in, particularly in leaders, but many leaders have built a self-concept around being the person who sees things coming, who doesn't get caught off guard, who holds everything together. And what I've also been aware of is that catastrophizing can become entangled with that identity. So if you are somebody that has people responsibility, which is very natural in the world of HR, that we're responsible not just for our HR team, but the people within the organization, that we can feel like we're having to predict things that haven't yet happened. Now, that's very different to strategic thinking. That's very different to long-term planning. Again, it's that catastrophizing. That if I think about the worst case scenario, that I'm never the person who didn't see it coming. And the pattern gets recruited into the same story about who we are and impacts who we are being when we're doing. So if you haven't checked out that episode, I really invite you to do that. So here's what I want to offer you. This is not a technique. It's not about a coping strategy. This is not about stress management tips. I think we've all got enough stress management tips, but it is a different way of seeing this. Because the moment that Zoe recognized the pattern and saw it clearly for what it was, when she got underneath it and understood what was driving it, she was also able to see a kind of compassion for that part of her that had been working so hard for so long to keep her safe. And that's the doorway. The doorway to transformation has to start with self-awareness. Because when we're able to illuminate these patterns, when we're able to understand who we are being when we are doing these patterns and programs that are running on automatic, well, then we can start to change them. And quite often, it's the recognition, it's the insight that creates that shift. In the case of my client that worked at Sainsbury's, a huge thing that we've been working on is helping her to recognize who she's being when she's doing, to recognize and get really, really good at noticing when she's in her thinking. And something which she shared with me a few weeks ago is, I never realized how much I overthought everything. I never realized until we started to do this work just how tangled up I was in my head, that I was pretty much always operating from my head. And if we don't have that level of awareness, everything looks normal and natural. So when we can start to get really good at noticing when we have got caught up in these thought patterns, these habitual responses, it's not about judging ourselves for that whatsoever. It's simply about seeing it for what it is. Because the minute that we can observe something, we're no longer experiencing life from within the pattern, from within the thought, from within the belief. Instead, we're observing it from a higher mind. And when we can see what we're doing, then we come back to the present moment. The mind has got the ability to reset itself. And so when we see them as patterns, as something happening in us, rather than something that is us, that we make mean something about us, something that we think is personal, that this is me, that I'm broken, I'm wrong, well, when we can see that, then something shifts. Not always dramatically, sometimes it's subtle, but there's a loosening, a little bit more space. And from that space, we have a choice. Not the kind of like, I've got to learn to think positive and stop doing this choice. Not that kind of white knuckle choice. But the natural, organic choice that arises when we're no longer running on unconscious pilot. And this is what I mean when I talk about change from the inside out. And it's one of the key things that we explore within the HR Inner Circle, of which I promise you again, the details of that are coming. So in the meantime, I'd love to know how this lands, what insights this has given you. If you haven't already, then subscribe to the podcast. And for more details about the HR Inner Circle, then drop me a line at info@themindsolution.com. But until next time, have a wonderful day.